This is the Deconstructing National Mythologies and Narratives panel. I'm Colleen. I'll be chairing this panel along with you, Caitlin. Is that right?
I'll be here. Yeah, you're the chair, but I'll be helping you out. Yeah, with sharing.
Okay, sure. So I guess the plan, Caitlin, if I'm not mistaken, is to start with Wei Dong's poster presentation, which I think is the first poster that we have on the program, if I'm not mistaken, maybe the only poster we have. So the procedure from here, for those of you joining us for this panel, is I'll introduce her and we'll post a link to the poster. We have 10 minutes to read it. And then at the end of those 10 minutes, we'll start with the papers from Liam Ball and Zhun Gu. So I guess, Caitlin, you have the link to the poster?
We're actually, what we're going to do is just share it here. So you can introduce her, and then she's got just an audio file to introduce it. So I'm going to share that in the meeting here, and then I'll share my screen so you can just look at her poster here.
Okay, super. Well, let me read this brief introduction then first. Wei Dong is a fully funded PhD student at the University of Nottingham in China, so the China campus. She holds a master's degree in Chinese history from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Her current area of research is contemporary Chinese visual culture. The poster that she has to present today is titled Gender, National Trauma, and the Flowers of War. So Caitlin? We've got her audio introduction. She was also unable to be with us in person, but she sent an audio introduction to the poster, which we'll have 10 minutes to read. So that means, I guess, at 3:53, we will convene for the papers. Yeah, 3:55, let's say.
Okay, here we go.
Caitlin, are we meant to hear this? I can't hear anything.
Oh, sorry, you can, no one can hear anything? Can anyone else hear anything?
No, nothing.
No? Oh boy, okay. Why would that be? Let's try this now. Let me know if you can hear this.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor to share my research about Chinese director Zhang Yimou's The Flower of War here. The research explores the relationship between gender narration, Nanjing Massacre in China, and The Flower of War, directed by Chinese filmmaker Zhang Yimou, adapted from Chinese-American writer Yan Geling's novel. This film narrates a history about Nanjing Massacre, which took place in December of 1937 during Sino-Japanese War, by focusing a group of marginal people, 14 prostitutes from Qinghua River in Nanking, rather than depict directly the braveness, heroism, and patriotism of Chinese soldiers in this event of national trauma. This movie narrates an episode of serious modern Chinese history by a fictional story about how these 14 women behaved in face of death. Therefore, the film could be regarded as a special way for Chinese people to commemorate the trauma of the state. I will begin with a review of Nanjing Massacre as a historical event and national trauma, as well as the previous cinematic representation. Then I examine how this film creates an effective experience of national trauma for the viewer by the use of close-up shot and point-of-view shot in the process of narrating an episode of women's history. After that, I analyze the character of Yu Mo, the heroine in the film, with the series of Lacan and post-feminism. I conclude by considering why this movie caters a national root and the differences between East and Western values, how the fictional story with a marginal historical background communicates in the world, without requiring knowledge about Chinese historical background and language. First, I will introduce Nanjing Massacre, national trauma, and cinematic representation. The Nanjing Massacre, or the Rape of Nanking, was an episode of mass murder and mass rape committed by Imperial Japanese troops against the residents of Nanjing, the capital of China, during the Second Sino-Japanese War. The massacre occurred over a period of 6 weeks, starting on December 13, 1937, the day that the Japanese captured Nanjing. During this period, soldiers of Imperial Japanese Army murdered disarmed Chinese civilians numbering an estimated 40,000 to over 300,000 and perpetrated widespread rape and looting. However, in Japan in the 1970s, some progressive Japanese intellectuals promoted a victimizer consciousness and argued for the importance of acknowledging Japan's victimization of other Asian people, even to the extent of elevating these experiences over Japan's own suffering. As Yang Daqing, a native of Nanjing who now teaches history in the United States, puts it, at a fundamental level, the debate over the Nanjing Massacre can be seen as a context between the memories of victim and those of perpetrator, and be seen as a context between the memories of victim and those of the perpetrator. In Japan, Yang points out, the Nanjing Massacre is a divisive issue between diehard conservationists and progressive leftist intellectuals, and the debate over the Nanjing Massacre is a microcosm of the clashes between larger ideological undercurrents in post-war Japan in terms of evaluating the past and making choices for the future. About cinematic representation of Nanjing Massacre on China's screen, Chinese, the Fudan and Nanjing film studios produced Massacre in Nanjing was the first feature film to focus specifically on Nanjing and to depict rape on screen. Massacre is also a striking transitional Chinese representation of Western witnesses. After that, there are Don't Cry, Nanking, The City of Life and Death. Then I will explain how the Flower of War memorize this national trauma by the narrative of the women's history. The victims of wartime rape are usually women, in part because the rape of women has often been imagined as the symbolic rape of the nation. Women's bodies are tied to discourses of ethnic origin, national growth, and population control. During conflicts between nations, the protection of women's bodies is envisioned as the protection of mythic origins, national sovereignty, and racial purity, representing rape within national discourse, best described by Tsai in her work on Comfort Women. According to Tsai, Comfort Women discourse displaces the women's subjectivity, which is grounded on pain, and constructs the women only as symbols of national shame. As such, the primary of discourse on Comfort Women attends not to the welfare of women's subjectivity, but to the national agenda of overcoming colonial emasculation. The Flower of War, prescribed by the West's Orientalist discourse about China, this cinema sets up the cultural, hierarchical, and gender relationship of the East-West encounter. The research starts from the perspective of female characters, 14 sex workers. To save the lives of girls, 12 of them dressed as girl students and then were sent to the enemy. 2 of them had been killed by the Japanese soldiers. In the cruel war and national trauma, these women left the opportunities of survival to the girls, regardless of what they will face. Furthermore, there are full of Oriental elements in the Flower of War. Qinghua River as a backdrop, Suzhou Pingtan as background music, traditional Chinese qipao as a costume. This cinema turns the horrible epic of Nanjing Massacre into a narration of feminism. However, I want to note that director Zhang Yimou intended to make a blockbuster film which would arouse equals in Western audience. However, he neglected that in Western values, there is no distinction between noble and humble in human life. Then the whole story of sacrificing themselves of the sex workers to give the opportunities of surviving to the schoolgirls may not be accepted by Western viewers. Thank you very much.
So our first paper presentation today is from Liam Ball. Liam, are you ready?
Yes, can you hear me all right?
I can hear you just fine. Let me finish my introduction and then you can take it away. Liam Ball is a PhD student and graduate teaching assistant at the University of Sheffield. His thesis focuses on socioeconomic concerns in the Australian horror film, particularly exploring how industrial economics inform aesthetic and generic conventions in the national horror tradition. He has presented at conferences across the UK on this topic, as well as on other national generic traditions, such as the Hong Kong martial arts cinema. He is currently preparing an article for publication on exhibition practices in Australia during the 1970s and how these played a role in the development of the local horror film. His presentation today is titled "Sorry, Skippy, the Development of Nostalgia in Australian Horror Cinema." So Liam, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Just gonna share me, get my screen share going. Right, is that there?
Looks just fine, thanks.
No worries, okay. So the aim of this paper is to shine a bit of light on the understudied Australian horror film tradition and its complicated relationship with its mainstream counterpart, particularly relating to their sometimes convergent treatments of nostalgia. So for a long time, there was a split between the mainstream and the minor stream. In the 1970s and 80s, mainstream Australian films tended to rely on Australian literature, usually historical or biographical novels, in order to create a culturally prestigious body of work that could work towards forming a recognisable Australian national cinema. Of course, they were also responding to the commercial success of mainstream hits such as Picnic at Hanging Rock and Caddy from 1975 and 1976. And in many ways, they were trying to repeat the same qualities for commercial gain. As Jonathan Rayner argues, rather than aiming for an aesthetic and cultural exclusivity, period films exploited a briefly popular nostalgia for an unchallenging cinema, expressing and encouraging pride in a constructed communal past. Now, this briefly popular nostalgia that Jonathan refers to was the rise of new nationalism in the 1970s, which saw a cultural move away from the conservatism of the post-war Menzies years and towards a full celebration of Australian cultural values. At the same time, minor stream filmmakers working in generic traditions were using original IP to tell contemporary cosmopolitan narratives, using conventions that neutralized the cultural specificity of these narratives and made them easier to sell to foreign markets. This was essential for the success of the Australian film industry, given that the national population around this time was only about a quarter of that of the UK, despite being 30 times the size of it. Many of the genre-oriented filmmakers were either trained in Hollywood filmmaking styles or were inculcated by the omnipresence of Hollywood cinema in Australian culture. What's it doing? There we are. So North American horror at this time, which was obviously, as I say, like a huge influence, was emerging from its own insistence on period narratives that had determined the genre throughout much of its history. Starting with the publication and subsequent adaptation of Rosemary's Baby, North American horror cinema was beginning to tackle contemporary concerns in films such as Deliverance, The Exorcist, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Jaws. And I mention these films particularly, not just because they were the most successful or among the most successful, but because they were each integral in establishing new concerns for horror film globally. With Deliverance, we saw the rise of hillbilly horror. With The Exorcist, possession horror, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the slasher, with a bit of hillbilly thrown in for good measure. And with Jaws, the popularization of animal horror. In Australia, these influences manifested in films like Patrick, which takes elements of the telekinesis from The Exorcist and Carrie and gives it to a bloke in a coma. And like Jaws, a lot of the eco-fiction of the period, Long Weekend, sees an entitled middle-class couple fall prey to nature's revenge. And films such as Nightmares and Next of Kin lean into the slasher narrative pioneered by Texas Chainsaw and Black Christmas. There was an overriding passion for Hitchcock as well, especially with Everett DeRoche, who'd written most of the films that I've just mentioned, and Richard Franklin, who was such a big fan of Hitchcock that he connived his way into being his friend while he was at uni, while Franklin was at uni, not Hitchcock, obviously. But yeah, despite the American influences and the somewhat neutral styles of these films, these cosmopolitan horror stories were indeed relevant to Australian culture, albeit not in the most positive of manners. Many of them, including the science fiction hybrids such as Mad Max and Turkey Shoe, are deeply critical of Australian culture, particularly of the new nationalism, which is portrayed in these films as being less progressive than it made itself out to be. So as well as counter-programming the mainstream cinematic traditions through the use of contemporary settings, the Australian horror filmmakers of this era counter-programmed the new Australian nostalgia itself. Alas, the funding landscape changed in the 1980s, becoming less overall secure. There became less overall security and yet greater incentives for private investment in Australian cinema. While this meant there was less money being thrown at the local genre output in attempts to generate, there was more money being thrown, at the local genre output in attempts to generate a quick buck. The horror bubble eventually burst in the mid-80s and depreciated towards a point of almost zero output. This can be traced from the late 1980s throughout all of the 1990s and into the 2000s. While certain commentators have observed a drop in quality among the horror films of the period, which they blame for the fall, this also reflects the changes in the wider global horror market that Australian producers were always aiming to get into. In the US, most importantly, the bubble had burst there as well. An oversaturation of ultra-violent slasher movies in the early to mid-1980s did a lot to trigger a progression in audience taste to subtler, more psychological horror movies, best encapsulated by Silence of the Lambs in 1991, which of course had the full endorsement of the Academy. It's widely held that more straight-laced horror was a hard sell during this period altogether, and the Australian film industry tried to adapt with dark character studies such as Death in Brunswick and Bad Boy Bubby. This type of film eventually gave way to full-on crime thrillers such as Heaven's Burning and psychological thrillers such as The Interview by the end of the 90s. Meanwhile, the period cinema bubble began to burst too, although it did this sort of earlier, around 1982, and it also had the full support of the federal funding bodies behind it. And it adapted in much the same way as the American blockbuster did to the recession of the 1970s and the emergence of multiplex theatres in the 1980s. Did this by going for broader appeal, targeting several potential markets at once and consolidating various bankable assets into one single package. This was also enabled by the upcoming bicentenary celebrations in 1988, which initiated a widespread celebration of both the history of Australia and the nation it had become in the modern era. In general, the period inspired a wider sense of nostalgia among the white Australian settlers, among the majority white Australian settlers who were eager to celebrate 200 years since the British Empire's invasion of the continent. Alongside the televised events that marked the period, ancestry briefly became a fad for a lot of white Australians who were compelled to see how long the family had been in Australia and whether or not they were part of the first fleet of convicts. And films such as Crocodile Dundee fit right into this cultural moment of celebrating the past in the here and now. Like many of the earlier period films, it aimed for the spirit of the Australian legend, which is a concept that was termed by Russell Ward during the Conservative Menzies years. And Crocodile Dundee, the character, was in many ways the archetypal Australian. He was physically able, he could negotiate the continent's punishing landscape, and although he was adored by women everywhere, he always made time for his mates. The film's global success led to a wider spate of quirky comedies in the early 90s following on from Crocodile Dundee, such as Strictly Ballroom, Muriel's Wedding, and The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, and later films in the sort of later 90s, The Castle and Welcome to Whoop Whoop. What these films achieved beyond international success was a period in Australian cinema where the mainstream narrative concerns were contemporary lives and identities that were being celebrated or at least interrogated on a massive public scale. During all of this, there were some cultural developments that affected the ways in which mainstream Australian cinema viewed its history. First, there was the Mabo case in 1992, which revoked the doctrine of terra nullius that the British Empire had used as a recourse to invade Australia. Terra nullius essentially meant that Australia was considered legally empty and thus free for settlement. And of course, that was not really the case at all. And terra nullius had actually marked the beginning of the persecution of Indigenous Australians that persisted throughout most of Australian history. The persecution was addressed in a later report, which was entitled Bringing Them Home in 1997, which investigated the stolen generations where Indigenous children were taken from their families and rehoused in educational facilities hundreds or even thousands of miles from their parents. Meanwhile, Prime Minister John Howard, who was elected in 1996, was instrumental in steering the public opinion away from the negative black armband view of Australian history, which is a term that comes from historian Geoffrey Blainey in a 1993 lecture. The history wars, which thus erupted between right and left-wing factions of Australian politics, was not the dominant cultural force that a lot of scholars will make it out to be, but it did fundamentally alter the ways in which white Australians viewed their history, or at least encouraged them to form an opinion on it. Yet Felicity Collins and Therese Davis argue in their seminal book, Australian Cinema After Mabo, that these factors did in fact have a major influence on the films that were made in Australia. Their arguments are especially validated by the emergence of films dealing with 20th century experiences of Indigenous Australians under European persecution that emerged in the mainstream. Among the most notable of these films is Rabbit Proof Fence, Black and White, and The Tracker, all from 2002. More widely, though, Australian mainstream cinema was beginning to return to historical narratives, perhaps inspired by the global success of films like The Shawshank Redemption, The English Patient, and most of all, Titanic. The latter two in particular may have encouraged a spate of biographical adaptations, which materialised in films such as Chopper, The Dish, and at least the fourth or fifth version of Ned Kelly, all of which were inspired by real Australian stories, however fabricated those of the Kelly variety may be. Now, once again, the return of Australian horror film production was also inspired by industrial moves in the US, albeit not for the same reasons as earlier. Pardon me, sorry. So, Jamie Blanks is an Australian filmmaker, and he almost hit the jackpot when he submitted a trailer for a project titled I Know What You Did Last Summer to a company in America. And while the executives were impressed with the results, the actual direction job ended up going to another filmmaker. Nevertheless, Blanks was given the opportunity to work on a similar project named Urban Legend. It was a global hit, which meant that Blanks was able to make more reasonably successful studio horror films in North America, which was a first for an Australian horror filmmaker. And a few years later, Australians James Wan and Lee Wan-el would take the same route as Blanks for their debut project Saw. They produced a short version of the main plot after failing to get funding in Australia, submitted it to a US studio who agreed to finance the whole thing, and then some. Wan-el has frequently credited Blanks for enabling this to happen, noting that he enabled a precedent for Australian genre filmmakers to find work in North American studio horror production. Of course, this slightly oversees the transatlantic work done by filmmakers such as Peter Weir, Philip Noyce, and Baz Luhrmann, but then again, horror film production operates on a different wavelength to the higher budgeted affairs usually, so perhaps there is some validity in Wan-el's statements. Either way, the success of Urban Legends and Saw has often been cited as a reason as to why the Australian film industry returned to horror production after the downturn of the 1980s. It's probably a good reason why the South Australian Film Corporation and the FFC poured money into the horrendously violent Wolf Creek, which was made by a first-time feature writer-director, Greg McLean. And in the context of what's been covered so far, Wolf Creek's a bit of an oddity. It's one of the first major Australian films to be almost completely founded on nostalgic sentiments. And there was a little bit of precedent for this. I Know What You Did Last Summer, which was obviously meant to go to an Australian filmmaker to begin with, follows in the footsteps of Scream in that it pays reference to the US teen slashers of the 1980s. Saw went one step further and brought things to Australian concerns. It based an entire narrative on the scene from Mad Max, the original, where a character's ankle is chained to a burning car and he must saw it off in order to escape. But Wolf Creek is one of the only Australian period horror films produced since Inn of the Damned 30 years previously. It's based on the backpack murders, which took place in the Outback in 1996. And to structure this story, it leans on the premise of the cars that ate Paris, as in the villain waits for cars to break down at the titular Wolf Creek, which appears to happen to every car that goes to Wolf Creek, and then he scraps the cars and kills the tourists. And while the film itself is set in 1999, while it understandably views the real-life murders in a not very nostalgic way, the opening half hour is unusual for a horror film, in that an Australian horror film, in that it highlights various details from 90s Australian culture, particularly focused on the music and the nightlife. There is also a cinematic sequence set to Eagle Rock, the 1971 hit by the Australian band Daddy Cool that spent over 4 months at #1 in Australia. And this scene communicates a sense of carefree innocence against the Australian landscape. It's very redolent of the historical tourism Australia ad spots. It especially resembles the look and feel of the controversial advert that appeared around the same time as the film's release, which was called Where the Bloody Hell Are You?, starring Lara Bingle. But the cavalier mood of this sequence is more rooted in the Feel the Wonder Down Under campaign from the 1980s, which starred Paul Hogan, and popularised the idea of putting a shrimp on the barbie for international audiences. And Hogs is a massive, massive touchstone for Wolf Creek. It's directly referenced by the ill-fated backpackers once they meet the serial killer Mick Taylor, who himself was played by an Australian revival star and 80s genre star, John Jarratt. And besides sharing a first name with Hogs' famous character Mick Dundee, Mick Taylor initially encapsulates all of the nostalgic qualities associated with the earlier actor. He's friendly, he's hospitable, he's physically able, and he's got a cracking sense of humour. Mick Taylor also builds in the archetypes established by Chips Rafferty, who is among the most foremost actors of Australian cinema before the revival, who established the conventions of Australian screen masculinity in the 1946 Ealing production, The Overlanders. Rafferty would also play a key role in the revival of the 1970s. He appeared in some of the 60s precursors, such as They're a Weird Mob and Wake and Fright, both of which progressively unravelled his image as the larrikin established earlier in his career. Mick Taylor directly celebrates these performances too. Like Rafferty, and even more so than Hogs, John Jarratt is a tremendously imposing figure with an agreeable visage that can also turn deeply nasty, depending on which way the light falls on it. The key moment here comes when one of the backpackers tells Mick Taylor how cool it must be to run around in nature and say things like, "That's not a knife, this is a knife," which of course is a famous line from Crocodile Dundee. When he says this, Mick Taylor just stares at him. His expression and the length of time that he holds this expression for is almost identical to something that Chips Rafferty does in pivotal moments in They're a Weird Mob and Wake and Fright. As in Mick Taylor's example, Rafferty's threatening stare is used to intimidate characters who seem to think they're above him, such as in Wake and Fright when the schoolteacher character attempts intellectual humour. So although Wolf Creek is based on a horrible true story and views the story with the negativity it deserves, it frames its abandonment of period nostalgia by embracing metatextual nostalgia. In other words, it celebrates other past cultural elements that are just as horrible as the film itself aims to be. Indeed, this was a calculated risk for writer-director Greg McLean, who was frustrated at the falling through of an earlier project and decided to make something he was sure would make money. His aim was to create something along the lines of the bankable slasher characters of the 1980s, Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees, with something deeply Australian, which explains his decision to so strongly reference nostalgic elements of 20th century Australian culture. Yet McLean's business sense was also likely influenced by the recent trends in US horror, which had garnered success with Michael Bay's, with the Michael Bay produced Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, as well as the independent hillbilly horror throwback Wrong Turn. Indeed, Wolf Creek became part of a saga of global horror films that played on 70s hits such as Deliverance and The Hills of Eyes and The Last House on the Left. So coming full circle there a bit. While this movement proliferated in global horror, it did spin off on its own tangent in Australia, producing films like Dying Breed and Storm Warning, both of which are similar to Wolf Creek, following in its wake and trying to capitalise on its success. Ultimately, though, Wolf Creek indicated a meeting point between mainstream and genre uses of nostalgia, and this became evident in the local horror tradition in a variety of ways. For instance, there were remakes of Long Weekend and Patrick, the latter of which was directed by Mark Hartley, who had previously authored the nostalgic documentary Not Quite Hollywood that, like the remakes, fondly celebrates Australian genre history. Other films like Boar and Rogue heavily reference 1980s films such as Razorback and Dark Age, to the point of almost being remakes in their own right. Meanwhile, Van Diemen's Land and Dying Breed both dug into colonial history, which was a first for Australian horror, by both utilising the story of cannibal convict Alexander Pierce. Snowtown and Hounds of Love are both based on the suburban true crime stories. Like Wolf Creek, they evoke ugly periods of Australian history, yet they supplement their narratives with retro period detail that, at least in Hounds of Love, breaks up the horror with nostalgic elements. Van Diemen's Land and Dying Breed also explore ideas of the Australian landscape in a purer state before total colonisation, exploring the beauty of the Tasmanian interior without necessarily neglecting its sinister implications. Berlin Syndrome, which is obviously set in Berlin, refers to films such as Wake in Fright. It's essentially a gender-swapped version of it, and it's also a period narrative in itself as well. And Storm Warning is based on a previously unused script by Everett de Roche, who, as I mentioned earlier, was one of the key architects of Australian genre cinema during the 70s and 80s, and whose name is attached to films like Patrick and Wolf Creek, both remade on there as well. All in all then, the commercial impetus provided by Wolf Creek inspired a new trend in Australian horror cinema, not to counter-program the mainstream tradition, but to join in with its recent kick of nostalgia, however reluctant it may initially appear to be on the surface. However, the counter-programming still continues to an extent, whereas mainstream films, recent mainstream films tend on the whole to celebrate historical periods or values on screen, or not in the case of films like Sweet Country and The Nightingale. The Australian horror film, by and large, uses metatextuality to provide a negative viewpoint of comparative historical periods. While these negative histories or sociologies, within these negative histories or sociologies is a steadfast celebration of Australian genre cinema from the 1980s and 1970s and 1980s. It's not only used for homage purposes, but also weaponized to evoke similar criticisms as the ones deployed in earlier films in order to relay their commentaries for for contemporary issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liam, for that really detailed paper on the industry. Great job. Next, we have got a paper from Zhun. Zhun graduated from the University of Nottingham in the UK and is now working at the Journalism School of Fudan University in Shanghai, China. Currently, he is focusing on studies of cultural memory, nationalism, and film aesthetics related to Chinese film and television. His presentation today is titled The Analysis of Nostalgic Narratives in the Documentary of Li Ziqi. I hope I did that well, Li Ziqi, under the background of China's soft power communication. So, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you.
Okay, super. Thank you. Take it away.
Great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Go ahead. Take it away.
My name is Zhun. I graduated from the University of Nottingham in the end of 2019, and then I went to Fudan University to go on my postdoctoral research. And the title of this presentation is Cultural Articulation of Li Ziqi documentary on YouTube. Li Ziqi documentary was released 3 years ago on YouTube, and it updates at least one episode in every month. And so now it is very, very popular on YouTube. I want to introduce the background why I choose this topic. Is that I think for most Chinese audience, cultural criticals, and even the Chinese government, it is reasonable to present an emerging China under the background of the policy of culture going out. However, although many Chinese films achieved a higher box office in domestic in last 3 years, but their international box office were relatively low as individual heroism and heroism and positive national image cannot be effectively accepted by the overseas audience. So I think it would be better to consider what kinds of film narratives that the international audience will like, rather than directly propagandize the Chinese offensive national image when China's film go out, compared to the weekly international box office of the Chinese films. This paper noticed that Li Ziqi documentary, which is produced by Chinese filmmakers, but released on YouTube. So therefore, this paper is to examine how Li Ziqi documentary articulates a traditional national image of rural China with a common emotion of nostalgia to attract domestic and international audience. And this paper is still in progress, and now I have written two main bodies. The first is I investigate the box office of China's mainstream film in the last 3 years. And I try to identify that although the champion of these films got a very high box office in China, but the abroad box office is very, very low. So, and then I talk about Ziqi documentary to investigate why it can attract a lot of international audience and domestic Chinese audience. And then is a conclusion. And in the second main body, I use a Stuart Hall's theory of articulation to investigate how Ziqi documentary use this attract international audience. So the first, I investigate the several films, the champion films in Chinese film market. From the table 1 and 2, we can find that the box office in the Chinese film market, the box office of the Chinese films, and the percentage of Chinese films in the Chinese film market were steadily increasing in the past 3 years. At the same time, we also find that although the imported films have kept increasing year by year, the number of exported films, for example, to the USA were relatively small. In table 2, we further find that many of Chinese films have made tremendous box office in China. However, the abroad box office took a little percentage of the global box office. Therefore, the Chinese film have not actually achieved its ambition of going out. And I also find the reason from some international audience and also some Chinese scholars. For example, in the international website of IMDb, we can find a lot of audience to comment some champion of Chinese films. For example, many netizens discuss the Wolf Warrior 2, which is a champion film in the 1970s. And they think that it is a political propaganda film that combines heroism with the Chinese nationalism, in particular the patriotic tagline, whoever attracts China will be killed, no matter how far the target is. So all of this show that it is a distinct and direct Chinese nationalism, the image of the tough protagonists and China's military using force to resolve disputes in the film convene emerging and offensive national image, which may cause some foreign audience to challenge this direct propaganda. So I use Stuart Hall's theory of articulation to analyze Ziqi documentary, and it is a definition about articulation. So it it means a form of collection that unites two or more different elements under certain conditions, and it is a linkage which is not necessarily determined and essential for all time. And the theory of articulation is a way of understanding how ideological elements come here together within a discourse, and also a construction, articulation. And articulation is also a kind of construction, which means may form a new mechanism or connection to obtain new meanings. So I use this theory to investigate Ziqi documentary from two levels. The first is I identify that the Ziqi documentary construct idyllic and traditional countryside. For example, in the image 1, we can in the picture, in the image 1, sorry, it's a mistake. As shown in the image 1, the pictures of traditional food and comfortable way of life are not historical stories or memories shown in the museum, but the presentation of nature or rural Chinese countryside with family warmth. The concept of rural China has now been rooted in all levels of Chinese Asian society and has become a connective consciousness. Ni Ziqi presents this special identity to awake a sense of nostalgia related to the feeling of family or home. From the comments, we can, a lot of abroad international audience comment about Ni Ziqi lifestyle. And some of them say that from these comments, we can find that China and the world has established a connection through the common feeling of nostalgia, no matter how different ideologies of audience. Many of the audience express their approval for the family warmth and Asian agricultural civilization. China's style life of countryside and the nostalgia for family kinship for different groups of audience are articulated, which communicate an easy acceptance of rural China for Chinese and international audience. At the same time, we also find that the old linkage, China's media directly propagandize the government political discourse, and the abroad audience resistance about this kind of propaganda has been dissolved. And then in the next level of articulation, I find Ni Ziqi documentary use the bright and shadow nights that are normally used in the Western oil paintings to further communicate the image of rural China. There are many places in the documentary that use the contrasting nights of bright and shadow to depict the process of food making and decoration of Chinese traditional kitchen. For example, in the screenshot 1 and 2, the cooking stove, the chopping board, and the firewood are arranged by bright and shadow nights. Ni Ziqi as a main body is bright and her surrounding environment is dim layer by layer, which makes the Chinese traditional kitchen full of vitality and is a kind of artistic presentations. As shown in picture 3 and 4, this authentic technique can be easily found in many Western oil paintings. For example, in picture 3 and 4, therefore, this articulation between the science of Chinese traditional kitchen and the night techniques further promotes the broadcasting of this documentary. This is two kinds of articulation in this documentary. I also find that there are many other kinds of articulations. For example, Ni Ziqi as a farmer girl of China, and a lot of international audience see this image as a kind of independent female. So I also realize behind of this kind of articulation, it is the connection between official discourse and popular culture. That means in this documentary series, we can find it constructs a lot of kind of presentation about rural China. Ni Ziqi documentary not shows China's national image of rural China and the Chinese people yearning for a better life and taking care of family, but also enunciates many abroad audience about some collective consciousness, such as godliness and persistence for their lives. A large number of comments in the documentary have repeatedly proved that the cultural articulation have drawn the distance between abroad and domestic audience. This integration of national discourse and popular culture has become a strategy to narrow Chinese stories and avoid criticism about China's nationalism. And so this is the main body of my paper. The first part, I talk about the campaign, the result of Chinese films in Chinese film market and in the international film market. And I emphasize that although this campaign got a higher box office in China, but the abroad box office is very, very low. And then I try to identify some reason of this cultural and economic phenomenon, and then I try to explain this from the articulation and adopt articulation to explain this from two aspects. This is the first, and this is the second, and then is my conclusion. I think this paper suggests that the Chinese film need to listen to the voice of opposite audience and articulate with other culture to bridge a communicational platform. This cultural articulation does not cut to the West or be little China, but find similarities from difference and communicate a flexible and negotiated media culture, and thus gradually dispel a strong national discourse. And I also think that articulation is a strategy of ideological conflicts. It is not imposed or fixed structure, but adopt multiple social elements as a temporal integration to compete for ideological and political dominance. It is a conclusion. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. As I said at the top of the panel, unfortunately, Catherine Ben-Gesser will not be able to join us today due to connectivity issues in her home. But let's thank the presenters we've had. And so now we can open up the floor to questions for both Liam and Zhun. So do we have any questions from the audience? You can go ahead and put them in the chat if you want, raise your hand. I think this is a small enough group, you can just open your mic and go for it. Okay, Wickham, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I have a couple for you, gentlemen. Liam, I might have missed this because I'm dealing with sort of a baby running around. But my experience with Australian horror is predicated primarily on Jennifer Kent with The Babadook. And that sort of opened my eyes. I had heard of Wolf Creek, you know, I had heard of some of these other things, knew about a bunch of different Australian directors, but I was wondering with her movie, The Babadook, or even The Nightingale, which is kind of historical horror in a way, I was wondering if there was some sort of cultural analog or societal analog in Australia right now that she's sort of touching on.
Well, I think the sort of mainstreaming of feminist discourse, especially in Australia, starting towards the well, obviously there's a long history of feminist discourse in Australia dating back to at least the 70s, but there's certainly been like a mainstreaming of it in the past decade and just beyond. Mostly with Jennifer Kent, the sort of concerns that arise from that are, in my opinion, industrial, because the sort of funding landscape changed again in the sort of late 2000s to the legislation was brought in with Screen Australia, which consolidated earlier sort of film departments that were either sort of primarily interested in commercial funding and also cultural capital. So a lot of that laid in with the Australian Film Commission that was sort of consolidated into that. So the aim with funding nowadays is to create something that's culturally relevant and also commercially viable, if you see what I mean. So in a lot of cases, they do sort of prioritize, as I say, stuff that fits into sort of generic conventions, stuff that's like going to be sort of like blockbuster material, or hopefully blockbuster material with social or cultural relevance. So I wouldn't want to put anything on Kent's work from my perspective as sort of like a social analog, but I just know that the especially being a bloke commentating on where a woman might have got her work from, obviously, but the main sort of impetus behind it and the reason it exists is because of that sort of push for consolidating the two, you know, cultural and commerce. Sorry if that doesn't answer your question that well, but thank you for asking anyway. Thank you.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Zhu, how do you pronounce your name? I'm sorry.
Jason, please call me Jason.
Okay. I was curious because my wife is obsessed with Ziqi. Is that? I'm sorry for my pronunciation. Watching these videos, and I'm very cynical. So I keep saying, well, she has like a whole camera crew there. Like she's not living on a farm like by herself with her grandmother. Like there's a whole performative aspect to it. And I was wondering, kind of based off of your paper, I imagine this is better than sort of overt propaganda, as you were saying, in terms of kind of reaching more internationally. But do you think that this is viable, and is there for the long term, I guess, and is there still kind of this propagandistic kind of quality that is not entirely honest about the nature of what she is accomplishing with her videos? Because like I'll let you take over while I shut up my time. Was that a question? Did you understand what I was asking?
Sorry, could you please give me a brief question about what do you mean?
In the nature of like this being somewhat of a fraudulent message that is being promoted, in the sense that this Atlas, be quiet. I'm so sorry. In the nature of this sort of fraudulent message being that, you know, this independent woman in this kind of farming community, like some of it being slightly exaggerated for the sake of trying to appeal to an international audience. Do you still think that is, it's better, but do you still think that is good or appropriate, I guess, is my question.
Okay. I think it is still a kind of propaganda for Chinese TV industry, but it is different compared to the past documentaries, which, for example, show the glorious history of the Chinese Revolution or the CPC's history. But today, this the documentary adopts the nostalgia. For example, this nostalgia is not about the history, but about ancient traditional lifestyle, which may be set up in Tao Yuanmin lifestyle, which means 2,000 years ago, maybe. But from my perspective, it is still a kind of propaganda film, because in this documentary, in all of episodes, the documentary tried to present a kind of rural China, Chinese people, Chinese girl who are fighting for their lives, who look after the children's, not children's, their grandmothers. And we have a nature, a wonderful environment. It is because our government it is because we have a great government, and we have a great nature, we have a great environment. And I want to say more about the reason why I try to choose this documentary as the example. It is because in today's film cultural critics, for example, in film studies, a lot of famous critics still think that the campaign in Chinese film market is good because they communicate a great image about China, but the international box office is very low. And these famous cultural critics, it seems that they haven't found this cultural and economic phenomenon. So I try to tell them, not tell them, but identify that Ni Ziqi documentary is a good example, although it presents the rural China. But when we talk about the economy, we talk about the ideological. Maybe it is good for Chinese government, for Chinese Communist Party to propaganda a flexible China. Maybe it will be more easy for the international audience to accept this kind of image. Thank you.
Real quick, Stephen. He left a nice question. I wanted to add on to that. Is there a sense? Is the Chinese government, do they block, or is there some sort of covering of the production of this? Like I said, like the idea of this rural community with all of these fancy cameras and lighting, and you showed the images like that are reminiscent of the paintings. Is there a sense that there is kind of a cover up of the behind the scenes of just how big a production these documentaries are? Or is that part of the cultural discourse? Because that is something that I'm fascinated with, is this juxtaposition of rural China with all of this technology really accentuating and making as beautiful as possible the texture of things and the lighting and all that kind of stuff. I didn't know if that was available or, you know.
Thank you. I think it's very hard to say it's a kind of block for the Chinese government, or Chinese government try to block something like this. But I see this as a kind of cultural and economic transition, because in the past, Chinese government tried to directly to propaganda about I'm so good, you are bad. But then now they began to understand that direct propaganda is not accessible, effective. So they realize that they need to change the strategy to communicate a more flexible Chinese national image. So I think the emergence of Ni Ziqi documentary is a kind of cultural and economic results. We cannot see the result in 10 years ago, but just in today, we can say this, because the Chinese government also realized in the background of One Belt and One Road, we should communicate a flexible Chinese government image to the world. So the Ni Ziqi documentary, in the beautiful science, the harmonious environment in Ni Ziqi documentary is a good example for the Chinese TV industry and the Chinese government to communicate China's image today at this historic contemporary environment. Thank you.
Thanks. So Gu, before we move on, I just want to compliment you on the painting you've got in the background as well. I noticed you've got the gleaners on your wall. Nicely done.
Thank you. Thank you. So
well chosen. We're going to move now to the chat. We've got a couple of really great questions there. So Stephen Morgan's is first. I'll summarize real quick. I'm interested in your use of meta-nostalgia. This is for Liam, in relationship to Wolf Creek and the Mick Taylor character. And I'm wondering how that figures in terms of landscape and settler or national violence. Do you think Wolf Creek in some ways is in danger of reenacting the terra nullius idea by positioning the outback as mixed domain and an errant white outsider as the threat to be overcome? So Liam, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think it sort of slips through in the film's sort of commercial drive. But obviously, as you'll know, it's quite similar to the proposition in the way it sort of like not only photographs the landscape, but the sort of attitude towards the landscape. And it is analogous to films like Rabbit Proof Fence and The Tracker that did deal with Indigenous Australian experiences with white colonisation. And it does have that sort of pinning down of the white settler as the monstrous figure in the region as well, because obviously at the end of Wolf Creek 1, Mick Taylor just sort of like vanishes into the landscape, and he pretty much just emerges out of the darkness. You don't see where he's coming from, you don't see where he's going. He's basically just a part of it. And I think that is one way of pinning down the sort of terror that the white settler colonial figures inflicted upon the landscape. But I think the sort of absence of Indigenous voices in the film as well does kind of counteract it. I do agree with what you're saying, yeah. But I think because it was aimed for commercial sort of global sort of market consumption, as I was saying to Izzy earlier, it sort of consolidates those sort of Australian concerns into like a marketable package. I'm not saying that excuses it. I'm just saying that's my sort of take on it, because I don't think it excuses it at all. And I think there is a wider conversation to be had about the white approaches to the landscape in Australian cinema post Mabo, post Bringing Them Home, that positions the white settlers as the agents of violence without giving Indigenous voices any sort of flaw. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Okay, that's great. We have one more question in the chat for you, Liam. This is about the wild pigs. So without having seen Boar, this is from Craig Mann. Without having seen Boar, who's a fan of the monster pigs, do you think there's also a sense of meta-nostalgia to that film in terms of its relationship with Razorback, which is apparently the origin of the fandom of monster pigs? That sounds great, by the way, monster pigs as a theme for horror cinema, but anyway.
That's the next paper, I think. It's going to have to be. Boar is nothing if not completely like metatextual and very nostalgic, even for the director's own films. There's the director Chris Sun did a film a few years before that called Charlie's Farm, which I think is pretty good. A lot of people disagree with me, and barely anyone's seen it because it went straight to DVD and just sort of vanished into the ether, and only nerds like me care about it. So there's references to that, like direct verbal references to it and everything. John Jarrett's in that. There's actors from Turkish Shoot that are in that. And Nathan Jones is in that. And if you don't know, Nathan Jones is a Australian wrestler, probably the biggest person ever. And he was sort of like he was part of Australia's main sort of like cultural exports of the early 2000s. He was in WWE and all this, that, and the other. So there's all these Australian figures from different sort of periods, and obviously the central thing of Razorback and Boar. The actual boar in the film Boar looks like the Razorback from the film Razorback. So not even down to the sort of like infinitesimal details. It's sort of predicated on that sort of facsimile approach to earlier Australian horror cinema. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that was a very intelligent response to a question about monster pigs. Cheers, Liam.
Well, what's not intelligent about monster pigs, mate? Come on.
Nothing.
Yeah. All right. Cheers.
Okay. Do we have any other questions from on mic or in the chat? Okay. I have word that. Okay. One more question here for. Yes, Weidong. Unfortunately, she's not here to answer questions, Elke. That's the problem. She sent a pre-recording, so she's not with us for the presentation. So if you have a question for Weidong and her poster, I think it's best to contact her via email.
Sorry for that. I hadn't realized.
That's quite all right. No, quite all right. Anyone else? Okay, I have word that Stream B has wrapped up. There's one final question then for Liam. We'll take this one question. I think everybody else is kind of doing the Discord and lunch a little bit early. So one final question. How do you consider a relationship between fiction and nostalgia in horror cinema in general? So thank you.
I think in certain sort of cycles as time's gone on, like obviously earlier horror films had a sort of like distanciation tactic where it was using, it was kind of doing this to get around the censor, to be honest, but using sort of period narratives and literature like Frankenstein and Dracula and all this, that, and the other, to sort of ground its sort of fears without sort of like putting them into contemporary sort of too scary sort of approaches to the sort of affect that it was kind of going for. I think there's been a lot of as time's gone on, I think because horror is very much a minor stream mode of film production, it generally tends to exist outside of the sort of mainstream. It's usually sort of like, traditionally B pictures, grindhouse theatres, straight to DVD, all this, that, and the other. And I think as time's gone on, there has been an increase in nostalgia more generally, especially in found footage narratives, in the sort of recent films by, as I say, James Wan and Lee Wan. I'm putting this down to Australian cinema mostly because that is my sort of area that I know the most about. But people who grew up watching these films and really connected to them, as sort of like not so much like an outsider sort of thing, but because it wasn't mainstream, it felt more like theirs, if you know what I mean. And they have sort of developed a cycle of films that look nostalgically back at these earlier horror films in celebration of films, that people grew up with and all this, that, and the other, and really bonded to as teenagers. So I think there is, as I say, more work, but there's more work to be done on it, definitely. And I'm looking forward to catching more papers that on today that are connecting horror more generally with nostalgia. But yeah, I think that's, yeah, I think I've run out of words. Sorry, but thanks for asking.
Yes, Isabella, do you want to go ahead and open your mic?
Yeah, sure. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes, just fine, thanks.
Sorry, not in a great location for a video, but it was a really great paper. I really loved the establishing of the just the full history of the Australian horror through those eras, especially in relation to sort of the mainstream, especially as Australia doesn't produce sort of as much fare as, say, Hollywood. But I was wondering, what's your opinion on sort of that expansion of Wolf Creek into the global horror sort of arena? So I'm thinking about the Wolf Creek TV series and how a lot of people outside of Australia have taken Mick Taylor as a sort of like admired villain, a la sort of Mike Myers and of that genre. And I was wondering what your opinion on that is in terms of how people receive national nostalgia outside of the original country.
Yeah, well, so one of the things that I mentioned earlier in the paper that I wanted to follow up on, but ended up having to cut, was that the sort of neutralization of the cultural specificity in a lot of genre films made in Australia does tend to be not a complete neutralization altogether. And yeah, it doesn't. It tends to sort of minimize it to a certain extent, in that it's not necessarily about Australia itself, but has a lot of Australian signifiers. And I think Mick Taylor is the best example of that altogether, because Greg McLean wanted to make basically Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, all this, that, and the other into the biggest Australian like supervillain ever. And essentially the sort of use of nostalgia and like international sort of touch points, especially Paul Hogan, who was like world famous not just for Crocodile Dundee, but for putting a shrimp on the Barbie. The sort of consolidation of that into a single sort of figure becomes like a marketing technique over the next sort of few sort of years of horror filmmaking in Australia. So the sort of use of Alexander Pierce in Dying Breed, for instance, and all this, that, and the other. And the expansion of that really sort of like rides on that sort of like perfect, as I say, consolidation, yes, of Australian international cultural signifiers, I think. Does that answer your question?